I've always loved robins. Now, you boys out in radio land, don't shoot at my birds. You see, they're my birds. Did you ever hear the legend of the robin, how he got his red breast? I'll stop here a moment. How he got his red breast? There was the King of Kings was dying one day on the cross. And he was suffering and no one would come to him. He had no one to help him. And there was a little brown bird wanted to take them nails out of the cross. And he kept flying into the cross and jerking on those nails. He was too little to pull them out. And he got his little breast all red with blood. Ever since then, his breast has been red. Don't shoot him, boys. Let him alone. He was sitting at the side of the window, chirping as the robins sing, and Dad pushed back the window, and when they pushed the little window door back, that light that you see in the picture come whirling in the window. Says my mother, and hung over the bed. Grandmother didn't know what to say. Now, was not a religious family. My people are Catholic. I'm Irish on both sides. My father is strictly Irish, Branham. My mother is Harvey, only her father married a Cherokee Indian. So that broke the little line of the blood of the Irish. And father and mother did not go to church, and they married out of the church, and they had no religion at all. And back there in the mountains, there was not even a Catholic church. So they come over in the early settlers. 2 Branhams come over, and from that sprung the whole generation of Branhams as the genealogy of the family. And then when they opened this window and this light stood in there, they did not know what to do. Dad had bought him, Mama said, a new pair of overalls for this event. He's standing with his arms in the bib of the old overalls like the woodsmen and loggers used in those days. And it frightened them. Well, after I'd got up maybe 10 days old or something, they'd taken me up to a little Baptist church called Possum Kingdom. Possum Kingdom Baptist Church. That's quite a name. There's an old circuit preacher, the old-fashioned Baptist preacher, came through there about once every 2 months. The people would have a little service together. They'd go sing some songs, but they had preaching ever so often on the circuit rider. They paid him each year with a sack of pumpkins and a few things like that, that the people had raised to give him. And the old preacher came by, and there he offered prayer for me as a little boy. That was my first trip to church. At the year of about something a little over 2 years old, the first vision taking place. Well, they had told around in the mountains there that this light came in. So they tried to figure it up. Some of them said it must have been the sunlight reflecting on a mirror in the house, but there was no mirror in there and the sun wasn't up. So it was too early at 5 o'clock. And then, they just passed it by. And when it was about, supposed to be near 3 years old, now I have to be honest. There's things here that I do not like to say. And I wish I could bypass it and not have to say it, but yet to tell the truth, you must tell the truth. If it's on yourself or your people, be honest about it, and then it's always the same. My father was a long way from being a religious person. He was a typical mountain boy that drank constantly all the time. And he had gotten in some trouble in a fight. And there had been 2 or 3 men almost killed as they fighting, shooting, and cutting one another with knives at some kind of a party up in the mountains. And Dad had been one of the ringleaders of this fight because it had been a friend of his that got hurt and hit someone with a chair, and the man had a knife out and was going to cut Dad's friend on the floor with this knife through his heart, and Dad took his part. And it really must have been a terrible fight, because they, from all the way down to Burkesville, many miles away, they sent a sheriff up after Dad, horseback. So the man was laying at the point of death. Might be some of his people listening in. I'm going to call his name. Will Yarberry was his name. Probably, I think some of them is in California, his boys. But he was a bully. Great, powerful man. Killed his own boy with a fence rail. So he was a very powerful and wicked man. And so there was a great knife fight between he and Dad, and my father almost killed the man. So he had to run and leave Kentucky and come across the river to Indiana. And he had a brother that lived at the time in Louisville, Kentucky. It was the assistant superintendent of the wood mosaic sawmills in Kentucky, in Louisville. And so Dad come to find his older brother. Dad was the youngest of the boys, of 17 children. And so he came to find his older brother. And while he was gone for almost a year, he could not come back because the law was looking for him. And then when we had heard from him by letter, signed by another name, but that he had told Mother how it would be, that she'd hear from him. And then I remember one day, the spring, this little cabin was just behind the house, and during that time, after there's 11 months difference between me and my next brother, and he was still crawling, and I had a big rock in my hand, and I was trying to show him how hard I could throw this rock in the old mud where the spring had run out of the ground and made the muddy ground. And I heard a bird, and it was singing up in a tree. And I looked up to that tree, and the bird flew away. And when it did, a voice spoke to me. I know you think I could not think and remember that, but the Lord God who judged the earth and the heavens and all there is knows that I'm telling the truth. That bird, when it flew away, a voice came from where the bird was in the tree, like a wind caught in the bush, and it said, "You'll live near a city called New Albany." And I've lived from the time I was 3 years old until this time within 3 miles of New Albany, Indiana. I went in and told my mother about it. Well, she thought I was just dreaming or something. Later we moved to Indiana, and Father went to work for a man, Mr. Wathen, a rich man. He owns the Wathen distilleries, and he owned a great shares. He's a multi-millionaire, and the Louisville Colonels and baseball and so forth. And then we lived near there, and Dad, being a poor man, yet he could not do without his drinking, so he went to making whiskey in a still. And then it worked a hardship on me, because I was the oldest of the children. I had to come and pack water to this still to keep those coils cool while they were making the whiskey. Then he got to selling it, and then he got 2 or 3 of those stills. Now that's the part I don't like to tell, but it's the truth. And I remember one day from the barn coming up to the house crying, because out at the back of the place was a pond where they used to cut ice. Many of you remember when they used to cut ice and put it in sawdust. Well, that's the way Mr. Wathen kept ice out there in the country. And Father was a chauffeur for him, a private chauffeur. And when this pond was full of fish, and when they would go to cutting the ice and bring it in and put it in the sawdust, and when the ice melted in the summertime, as it went down, it was kind of clean, I suppose, more like a lake ice, and they could use it not to drink, but to keep water cold, put it around the buckets and their milk and so forth. One day, packing water from back out at this pump, which was about a city block, I was squalling to who wouldn't have it, because I'd come from school and all the boys went out to the pond fishing. I just loved to fish. And so they all got to go fishing but me, and I had to pack water for this still. Of course, that had to be mum is prohibition. And it was such a hardship. And I remember coming along there with a stump toe. I had a corn cob wrapped under my toe to keep it out of the dust. Did you ever do that? Just put a corn cob under your toe like this and wrap a string around it. It holds your toe right up like a turtle head almost, sticking up. You could track me everywhere I went with this corn cob under my toe where it stumped, I didn't have any shoes to wear, so we never wore shoes sometime half the winter. And if we did, it was just what we could pick up somebody would give us. And clothes to what somebody charity would give us. And I stopped under this tree. And I was sitting there just squalling. It was in September. Because I wanted to go fishing, I had to pack several tubs of water with little molasses buckets. Just about that high, half a gallon, because it's just a little lad of about 7 years old. And I'd pour them in a big tub and then go back and get another 2 buckets and come back pumping it. That's the water we had. And there's going to run off a batch of that corn whiskey that night. These men with Daddy up at the house. And I was crying, and all at once I heard something making a noise like a whirlwind. Something like this. Now I hope it isn't too loud. Going, just a noise like that. Well, it was awful quiet. Now I looked around, and you know what a little whirlwind, I believe you call them little cyclones in the fall of the year. They pick up through the cornfield, the leaves and so forth. In the autumn there, the leaves had just begun turning, and I was under a great white poplar tree, stood about halfway between the barn and the house. And I heard that noise, and I looked around. It's just as quiet as it is in this room. Not a leaf blowing nowhere, nothing. And I thought, where's that noise coming from? Well, I thought, must be away from here, just a lad. And it got louder and louder. I picked up my little buckets and squalled a couple more times and started up the lane. I was resting. And I got just a few feet from that, out from under the branches of this big tree. And oh my, it made a whirl sounding. And I turned to look, and about halfway up that tree was another whirlwind caught in that tree, just going around and around, moving those leaves. Well, I thought nothing strange about that, because it just, in that time of year, and the autumn, those whirlwinds come, we call them whirlwinds. And they pick up dust. You've seen them on the desert like that, same thing. So I watched, but it didn't leave off. Usually it's just a puff for a moment, and then it goes, but it had already been in there 2 minutes or more. Well, I started up the lane again, and I turned to look at this again. And when it did, a human voice, just as audible as mine is, said, "Don't you never drink, smoke, or defile your body in any way. There will be a work for you to do when you get older." Why, it like this scared me to death. You can imagine how a little fella felt. I dropped those buckets, and home I went just as hard as I could go, screaming at the top of my voice. And there was copperheads in that country, snakes, and they're very poison. Mother thought, coming alongside the garden, I'd perhaps got my foot on a copperhead, and she ran to meet me, and I jumped up in her arms, screaming, hugging her, and kissing her. And she said, "What's the matter? Did you get snake bit?" Looked me all over. I said, "No, Mama, there's a man in that tree down there." And she said, "Oh, Billy, come on."